Welcome back, y'all, to another episode of Ask the Expert, the show that breaks down the science of bleeding disorders in a way that is simple and clear. I am your host, Amy Board, and today we're strapping in for a brand new ride. The safety procedures behind the emerging world of therapies, much like rebalancing agents for bleeding disorders. You know, safety talk isn't always exciting, but with these new treatments, I think it's crucial. Think of it like a roller coaster. Inspectors check the track, every bolt. They make sure every seatbelts click. And that's what safety in medicine is all about, making sure that ride is smooth and secure for everyone on board. Today, we're buckling in with three of our incredible guides, Dr. Mark Redding, Dr. Janice Stabler, and Dr. Tammy Singleton. Together, they're going to help us understand how emerging therapies are tested, monitored, and kept as safe as possible. But first, a quick word from our sponsor.
Hemophilia A and B are both bleeding disorders. However, they have their own unique pathologies and clinical features. Preclinical studies have shown that after infusion, individuals have 3 times more factor IX in the extravascular space than they do in the bloodstream. Due to the distinct behavior of factor IX, multiple pharmacokinetic or PK parameters should be considered when assessing the treatment and management of hemophilia B. So what does this mean for people with hemophilia? Visit the bigger picture in hemb.com. This site is intended for US HCPs only.
Just a personal note to thank Sanofi for making this possible. We could not do this whole thing without you. Now, before we dive into the science and safety checks in place for rebalancing and non-factor therapies, let's look at how treatment has evolved. Dr. Redding walks us through the journey and reminds us why today's approach demands careful safety checks.
I mean, all the factor replacement medicines that we've had prior to 2014, when the first of the extended half-life or the EHL factor products came around, all of the standard half-life products basically work the same. So the doses are the same, the dosing schedules are the same, the way they make your blood clots the same, the way the levels go up and come down, pretty much the same. Didn't matter which one you picked, they're all going to work the same. When the extended half-life factor products came out, the first ones of those came around in 2014, for the first time, we had to sort of get our heads around the notion that, oh, these are not just the same as all the other ones before. They do work a little bit differently. The doses are a little bit different. The way we measure their levels, some of our lab tests work better for some versus others. So it started getting a little more complicated. And now, as we move forward beyond factor into non-factor, so emicizumab or Hemlibra was the first one of those, that factor VIII mimetic. And now these rebalancing agents, now the complexity is getting much, much greater because the mechanisms of action, the way these drugs work are all very different. The way they're dosed is different. The number of milligrams, the number of times you have to give the medicine is different. And the effects on the way they make the clotting system work are different. How we would treat a breakthrough bleed if it were to happen, or how we were to manage someone going through surgery is going to be different depending on which of these specific medicines you're on. So it's getting much, much, much more complicated, and we can't think of all these drugs as all being the same anymore. They're all really unique and different. That's going to make the sort of the clinical decision-making much more complicated and the clinical use of these drugs much more complicated.
Okay, so the ride isn't just more complex on paper. It shows up in real emergencies too. Let's imagine what happens when a patient shows up in the ER today versus, let's say, 10 years ago.
It used to be, years ago, if I got a call from the emergency room and a patient was in and like, oh, this is a guy with hemophilia A and he's bleeding, what do I do? I would say, I'll just give him this. And we knew it would work because all the drugs we had to pick from worked the same. Now that phone call is going to be a lot more complicated because I'm going to need to know which medicine is this person using. And that's going to have an impact on how I deal with an acute bleeding episode. And so I'm going to have a whole lot more information to understand how to safely manage that person. And that's going to be something we're going to have to just get used to. And it's going to take us a while.
So yes, sure, the track is trickier, but that doesn't mean riders should panic. Here's how Dr. Redding frames it when talking with patients.
So I think the take-home part of this is that the complexity of not only the decision-making around which medicine to use, but the complexity of the things we have to think about when we're managing these patients in sort of acute situations like showing up in the ER or needing a surgery. That's going to get way more complicated, and it's going to require a lot of expertise and a lot of coordination between all the different people involved in caring for these patients to make sure we do it right.
It's not about fear. It's about caution. The ride has different functions to consider, which means inspectors check more often and more carefully. So what does that look like in real life?
Should patients be afraid? I would say no. I don't think patients should be afraid. The whole goal of clinical trials is to figure out the safety part. And if these drugs aren't safe, they're not going to be approved. So I don't think people should be afraid, but I think people need to be informed. And that means you really got to talk to your treatment team. So talk to your HTC people, make sure you understand all that. The way we figured this out is that, we saw some clotting events. And so we looked at why did that happen? And the reasons are a little bit different depending on which of the drugs and which of the trials we were looking at.
Okay, please note that more loopity-loops doesn't necessarily mean more danger. The real risk comes if the car tilts too far to one side, and that's exactly what doctors watch for in clinical trials.
One of the things that we learned is that if you over-rebalance, in other words, if you take away too much of one of those regulatory proteins, you don't just restore the balance, but you tip it the other way. Okay, so you can't just dump in as much as you want. You got to be careful how much you dump in, and in this case, how much you take out. So just like factor, right? When we do factor replacement therapy, we don't just give a huge dose. We give a specific dose to get the factor level to a certain point, enough to get the job done, but not too much, because remember, too much clotting, too much hemostasis becomes thrombosis. So one of the things we learned is that we got to be careful that when we do rebalancing, we don't overdo it. The other thing that we learned is that if you're using one of these medicines to help keep you from having bleeding, but you do experience a bleed and we have to use other medicines to stop that bleed. So if we have to treat you with factor, or if we have to treat you with a bypassing agent, if you've got an inhibitor to stop an acute bleed, the way those drugs work with these other drugs already in the system can be an issue. And so if you have a rebalancing agent in the system already, and you add factor or a bypassing agent to treat a bleed, we have to be careful how much we use, because if we use too much, the potential for clotting is going to be greater.
So that is the balancing act. Too little clotting is dangerous, but too much is just as risky. Luckily, that's exactly where our safety protocols step in.
Those are the sorts of things that we learned in the clinical trials. And what do we do about it? We adjusted the dose of some of the medicines in some of the trials so that we didn't take away too much, didn't over rebalance. And we adjusted our protocols for managing breakthrough bleeds so that we don't use higher than necessary doses of factor or bypassing agents to treat bleeds. And so we made some adjustments in those protocols on those two fronts to address this issue of clotting. And those, what we call mitigation strategies, how do we kind of like mitigate or decrease the risk? They've been effective. So when the clinical trials got up and running again with the tweaks that we made to the protocols, they went forward and we didn't see more clotting events.
Okay, so the clinical trials give us a carefully controlled test track. But what happens when the ride opens up to the public? When people with other health conditions, infections, or even accidents start getting on board?
I mentioned earlier how long these clinical trials have been going on. That's part of why it took so long, because there were a couple of pauses in some of the trials to figure that stuff out. And then we have to go back and show that the strategies we put in place are actually working. And so we did see less clotting, and it just takes a lot of time to do that. So we'll have to continue to refine some of those approaches in the real world. So one of the things that I worry about is, in a clinical trial situation, it's very regulated. The people that are in clinical trials are usually, healthy and very closely monitored. What happens in the real world when we start using these medicines in broader populations, people that might have less good health at baseline or might have other medical things going on that might make them a little bit different than the clinical trial patients. And then in the real world, other stuff happens, like, you get appendicitis, or you get a pneumonia, you get an infection, or you develop a cancer, things that have an effect on your clotting system anyway. So when you throw that variable into the mix, how is that going to impact all this is something that we don't have a lot of data on from the clinical trials, but we're going to get that experience in the real world. As we're real people in real world settings use these medicines, other stuff will happen. Car accidents will happen, infections will happen, cancers will happen, and how all those things affect how these medicines work and how we have to adjust them is stuff that we're going to have to figure out.
Even with thorough trials, life throws us curveballs. Real-world patients can introduce new variables, and that's why ongoing monitoring and open communication with your care team is critical.
So I think we have a little bit of a sense of caution about that because we haven't learned all the things we need to learn. There are a lot of things that activate the clotting system, things like infections and cancer and trauma. And, we didn't see much of that in these clinical trials. We will see more of that in the real world because stuff like that happens. And I'm not scared of that or afraid of that. I'm more, weary I'm a little worried and I'm a little cautious. I'm a little apprehensive about it because I wish I knew more going into it, but we don't, and we're going to have to figure it out. So I think it's important when we're talking to our patients and their families about switching to a new drug that we talk about some of that stuff. I mean, there are still going to be some unknowns. We know from the clinical trials that they're safe and effective, but there's more stuff that we will learn in the real world experience. And we just all have to work together to make sure that we're paying close attention and continuing to talk about and gather data. Once a drug gets approved, we're not done. We're not done learning about it. We're not done gathering data and understanding how to continue to use it safely and effectively. And that's a process that'll have to continue going on. And now we're going to have to do it with a lot of new drugs. It's going to make it really complicated. If you don't have an inhibitor, you would still use factor 8 or factor 9 replacement therapy, but the doses that we would use might be different. So depending on which rebalancing agent you're using, we may not use standard doses that you've been used to using. So that's going to have to be really carefully thought out and make sure that everybody knows that we might not be able to do it the way we've always done it. We might have to do it a little bit differently. If you're an inhibitor patient and using a bypassing agent to treat a breakthrough bleed, kind of the same thing. We would use the same medicines, but we may need to use smaller doses to make sure we're doing it safely.
And just like any ride, safety rules aren't one size fits all. Riders of different ages, health backgrounds, or conditions have slightly different seatbelts, and doctors adjust those harnesses accordingly.
Right now, they're approved for adolescents and adults, so usually age 12 and above. There are pediatric studies, and those are almost always a little bit further behind. So we start out usually in adults, and then they will go down to adolescents, and then doing it in children, which is generally under age 12. That usually takes a little bit longer time. So they kind of want to see safety data and stuff first before we do this in kids, because obviously it's a little bit different situation when you're thinking about informed consent for a clinical trial and that kind of thing. So I do think eventually we'll have approval for all ages, but at least initially right now, it's going to be 12 and above.
Inspectors check every track, but every rider is different. Even with strict rules, patients respond in their own ways. Some never have issues, while others might experience unexpected reactions. Dr. Janice Stabler explains how researchers navigate these real-world variations to keep everybody safe.
The brick wall may keep getting built, and it didn't need to be, built out the way that it needs to. But maybe everybody's right on track and they build it just right. So there may be times where some patients have no clotting problems ever. They get on these agents, no clotting problems ever. And there may be, and there has been, on the trials, there were patients who had clots who would have never had clots before, right? Because they had a bleeding problem. I think it's a really good conversation to have for, each individual patients, because truly these drugs for patients can be really life-changing.
Even breakthrough treatments come with new questions and sometimes unexpected risks.
Knowing that there are these risks, there are potential for complications, that we have good conversations with patients, because they could have a clot in certain situations. Now, again, that's not most patients. There were a few patients that had problems, but for both the siRNA to antithrombin and also the anti-TFPI trials. But again, were not common events. Most patients didn't have that, but it's, again, a good conversation to have for each individual.
Safety doesn't just happen in the lab. It's a global effort. Investigators, manufacturers, and regulators all give the ride a final check before you can even get on board.
So I can speak from how we generally do it on clinical trials and not specific trials. So they're all slightly different but have similarities. Most trials, most phase 1 trials have times where all the investigators, and generally for hemophilia, that's around the world. So when we're talking about like experts in the field, this is experts from the US, experts from Europe, experts from Asia. This is around Australia, around the world, generally are how these studies are conducted. And so we get the benefit of, they're pretty scrutinized from all of the, not just the FDA, but the equivalent of that is called the EUA in Europe, for example. So all of those different agencies have very strict requirements as far as how often and when and how things are deemed safe or not to go on.
That collaboration ensures that before any treatment reaches patients, it's been tested, discussed, and agreed upon by those who understand the stakes best.
So the investigators get together and generally kind of chat about the safety, And some of those would get, especially for like a phase 1, would kind of get voted on for like, and everybody needs to be okay with proceeding with that trial and studies the drug. And that's not the company has votes too, of course, but it's also on the investigators doing the trial to be like, hey, I think this is safe, or I don't think this is safe, or it's worth it or not. So we come together as a group. Now, once things get to phase 3s, it's much less likely to have those votes. So because the phase 1 is really, is it safe or not? The phase 3 is is it efficacious or not? So we've already gone through the process during the trials talking about, is something safe or not? So if it's gone through a phase 1, 2 trial and it's moved on to a phase 3, the focus for the phase 3 is still about safety, of course. We're not going to, because it's more patients, so we could have some rare events occur, but the focus is a little bit different and it's more on efficacy. So generally for a phase 3 study, the investigators are not involved as much with marking if it's safe or not outside of their own individual patient. And that can happen on a phase 1 too, but that's kind of the 2 different levels and 2 different types of screening for safety.
From investigators to global regulators, safety checks happen at every level. Kind of like inspectors giving every part of the ride a once-over, before it opens. Now let's hear from Dr. Tammy Singleton, who's taking us from the safety line to the science line, reminding us what rebalancing agents are really designed to do and why your treatment goals matter.
When we're talking about a rebalancing agent, we are still talking about a way to have a goal, to have a clot to form when we need it, but it's just happening in a different way. So instead of replacing what's missing, we now have an opportunity to think about the entire coagulant system in terms of procoagulants, anticoagulants, because your body has both. And how could we still have the needed end goal results, like the end results of having clot formation so that you don't bleed? How can we have that by looking at the 2 things that are involved, procoagulants and anticoagulants? And if you're missing some of the procoagulants, and the scale is now tipped a little bit, right? Like this. So you don't have enough of those procoagulants over here. And so you're heavier right on the body's natural anticoagulants, the body's natural defense system, right? To prevent clotting, prevent too much clotting. So you're heavier on this side. So bigger person sitting on the scale over here, lighter person over here. So how do you take some of the weight off on this side, take away some of those natural anticoagulants? So now you do this. And you're now back in a place where instead of having that scale tipped, you're now in a place where you can have clot formation that way. You didn't replace what was missing. You took away a little bit of another part of the system, the body's natural anticoagulants.
So in other words, rebalancing agents don't replace what's missing. They fine-tune the system to help restore balance safely.
So that's why we refer to them as rebalancing agents. So it's just a shift in terms of the education and like learning of how to recognize what a bleed is like when you're on a rebalancing agent, when you're on a newer therapy. Especially up front, a plan has to be put in place, and it takes some additional communication and kind of getting the hang of it.
So the science may be new, but safety still comes down to communication and knowing your plan.
And we still have to communicate. We just may communicate in different ways, maybe not quite as frequently, but early on, we have to make sure we get it right. And then whenever there's a question, you should still, in certain situations, especially if something could be potentially serious, treat it and then stop and make a phone call, right? And reach out for help. But with the rebalancing agent specifically, we do have a different way of approaching it with the breakthrough bleeding episode, a different way of approaching it from a surgical standpoint. So even though hemophilia patients are the smartest people out there, and even though for many years and sometimes generations, you know how to do this, you got this, you really do have to stop and make sure that you know exactly what the plan would be for you, and kind of make sure you can get the hang of it. So there are things that we have to do for sure to treat breakthrough bleeding episodes, for sure, to address and plan for surgical procedures.
A final reminder why these ongoing conversations and collaborations are crucial. They're your safety checks before boarding the new therapy ride.
It just looks different in terms of dosing, in terms of when to dose, in terms of how to dose, like all of that may be different. And so we all have to work together to recognize that it is different and to know how to approach it and to communicate often, when in doubt. So it's just different, and it just requires us all to have a slightly different approach as we approach this sort of shift in care with all of the new therapies that are available. And we would say, if a patient living with hemophilia had a bleeding episode, we were like, treat, have a bleed, treat. And then we said, you have a bleed, you're on another agent, call, chat, pause, pontificate, ponder. Hold on a second. Like, hold on. Be ready to treat, communicate, and then we can come up with a collective plan, because the cadence will change a bit.
#MyHemophilia_Truth. Real stories powered by Sanofi. It's time to consider the whole experience when it comes to managing hemophilia and change the conversation. Explore the full story at www.myhemophiliatruth.com.
So what did we learn on today's ride? Emerging therapies add twists, turns, and unexpected loops, but every loop comes with safety harnesses and inspectors ready to pause the track if needed. Clinical trials make sure the ride is tested. Regulators decide when it's safe to open, and patients, the riders, always have the power to raise a hand if something doesn't feel right. Remember, it's not about skipping the ride. It's about knowing your harness is secure, the brakes are tested, and you've got a team ready if the ride stalls or surprises you. Safety is a combination of smart science, careful monitoring, and open communication with your care team. And that's what keeps the ride thrilling but secure. A huge thanks to Dr. Mark Redding, Dr. Janice Stabler, and of course, Dr. Tammy Singleton for taking us on this journey. And thank you, listeners, for joining us. For more resources, check out the links in our program notes, including guides and tips to help you stay informed and confident with emerging therapies. I'm Amy Board, and this has been Ask the Expert. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep your seatbelt fastened. Did you know bloodstreammedia.com is your one-stop shop for all podcasts for the bleeding disorders and rare disease community? There you can find links to the Global Hemophilia Report and our flagship podcast, Bloodstream, with your hosts, me, and Patrick James Lynch. Also check out Flow, which is straight talk about extreme periods, and the Pain Pod, which is an in-depth storytelling odyssey of chronic pain. All this and more on bloodstreammedia.com, the #1 podcast network for rare disease. Have an idea for a future episode of Ask the Expert? Or have a question that you would like to hear one of our experts answer? Email us at mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com. You'll also find Bloodstream Media on Facebook and on Twitter and on Instagram and all those social media channels. I am your host, Amy Board, and until next time, stay curious, my friends.